Hi, I'm Douglas Keong, and I'm going to talk about the Explore Performance Task for the AP Computer Science Principles with Swift course. My views are my own. These do not represent the views of the College Board or the College Board Development Committee. I'm a computer science teacher, and I've taught computer science principles for about 3, 4 years now. 4 years if you count the pilot. And these any mistakes that I make here are purely my own. But with that said, let's talk about the AP Computer Science exam. So there are three parts to it. The Explore task, which is essentially a research paper, the Create task, which is an independent project, and the exam itself, which is 74 multiple choice questions taken over a period of 2 hours on one day in May. And all of those three components put together will come up with an AP score from 1 to 5, 5 being the best, 1 being not so good, and passing is generally considered 3, 4, and 5. So these are just some statistics from the previous years. So last year, we had about 74,000 kids take the exam, and almost 3/4 of them passed. And well, that was in 2017, I guess. And in 2018, the passing rate went down a little bit. I think the exam was scored a little bit more stringently in some ways, and we actually had more kids getting fours and fives. But then the overall passing grade was 72.7%. We are projected probably to hit 100,000 students taking the exam as of 2019. So it is the fastest growing AP course in history. So that's pretty exciting to be teaching this and to be supporting and helping teachers who are teaching this course. So your efforts make a big difference to a lot of kids. So um, I should have put those up earlier. That was the title. So, Explore Impact of Computing Innovations is the whole name of this performance task. This is 16% of their grade. It basically is composed of two things, a written narrative and a computational artifact. And I'll talk about what the computational artifact is in a second, but let's focus on the write-up because most of the score, to be honest, comes from the write-up itself. So kids are asked to research a computing innovation that has or could have significant beneficial and harmful effects on society, economy, or culture. Their computing innovation must consume, produce, and or transform data, and it must raise at least one data storage, privacy, or security concern. There's a 600-word limit, so we're looking at about 2 pages. And really, the focus is not on how the technology works, it's really more on what is its impact on society, economy, and culture. And the harmful and beneficial effects, they have to be part of the design of the computing innovation itself. It can't be a harmful effect that comes if the innovation doesn't perform as it's supposed to, because mistakes happen, hacking happens, all of those kinds of things happen. If it's not part of the innovation itself, it doesn't really count. And we'll talk about some other examples as we get into this. It has to be about an innovation that's real. So one year, a kid wrote a beautiful essay about the Star Trek transporter and its beneficial and harmful effects on human and Vulcan society. That doesn't count. It has to be an actual, real computing innovation. The way that they've really defined it is a computing innovation is an innovation that includes a computer or program code as an integral part of its function. Now, function is what it does. Effect is the effect, the result or consequence of the use of that innovation on society. Students often get the two of them confused. So in the portion where they need to be talking about beneficial and harmful effects, they'll simply talk about how it's used and not its effect on a group of people. And so that's a common mistake. And you'll see that when we look at some of these sample choices. So things teachers are not allowed to do. As a teacher, you can't tell kids what they're going to write about. You cannot assign a topic. You can't um, suggest that they write certain topics. You can't dissuade them from writing about topics that they decide they're going to write about. You can give them feedback on their process of choosing it, and you can certainly give them good and bad examples, but you can't really directly tell them what to write about. You also cannot provide suggestions or feedback on the responses they're submitting as part of the official performance task. And any practice responses that they do, you can't allow them to submit that for the real thing. So in our curriculum, AP Computer Science Principles with Swift, we've got 2 practice sessions. So we actually have kids write 3 responses for the Explore task, 2 practice and 1 real. And for the first practice one, we assign them the topic. I think it's like, I don't know if it's, I think it's drones. I think we just say write about drones. And the advantage is everybody's writing about the same thing, and then kids can talk about, and the teacher can give feedback on the responses. The teacher can tell them, well, here are some advantages to drones, here's some disadvantages, and you can have these discussions about that topic because you're not submitting it as the real performance task. For part 2, we're going to give kids a choice of 4 things. And kids can choose one of those 4 things to write about. And then after they've written their practice response, you then break them up into groups. And those groups can share and talk about, okay, oh, I didn't think about that. Oh, that's a good idea. I can talk about that. Or I should have talked about that as a beneficial effect on society. And then for the third part, where they actually submit the real thing, they can't choose any of those 5 practice topics that you've given them. And this is a good thing because, frankly, there are some topics that are overused. It's really not a good idea to choose drones or autonomous vehicles or Bitcoin because they've been used so much. They have practice. They're part of the practice examples. It's really Kids should be coming up with something a little bit different because they have to be that much better when they submit one of these ones that have been really done a lot in order to do well. So I think it's better for them to choose something that's not overused. And so that's why if we assign these for practice, then automatically all 5 of those are off the table. Good choices are things that are clearly computing innovations. So you can easily identify beneficial and harmful effects. It's very clear what kind of data that innovation uses. And kids don't have to make the case because the rubric is pretty clear. It's you either get the point or you don't get the point. So the bar, you just need to meet the requirement to say, I've discussed the kind of data that it uses. You don't get extra points for creativity. You don't get extra points for making a particularly good argument for what's essentially a marginal example. You don't get any credit for any additional credit beyond just saying, okay, this meets the standard. So it's better to choose something that's pretty clearly going to satisfy these requirements than to choose something if you're not quite sure about whether you can make the argument, then it's probably not a good choice for a topic. All right, so the computational artifact, that is basically a thing that you've done with a computer. It's an illustration, a representation, or an explanation of the computing innovation's intended purpose, its function, or its effect. So any one of those 3 is fair game. Good ideas are some sort of a visualization. So you can do an infographic using Pages or using Keynote. You can use in audio narration over slides. So you could use Keynote and then just record the Keynote presentation. You can do a video. You can act it out and do the video. There's all kinds of things that you can do. But the computer needs to be a part of making that artifact, which is what makes it a computational artifact. One year, one of my kids drew something on the whiteboard and then took a photo of it with their iPhone. That doesn't really count. That's not a computational artifact because the iPhone wasn't used in creating the artifact. It was simply used to take a picture of something that they did in analog form. So you should use one of the Apple iWork tools would be an awesome thing to use, for example. Keynote is really good. You could do 2 or 3 slides, submit that as a PDF, and you've got your computational artifact. You don't have to put it on one image, although you certainly can. Now, the Explore performance task itself, there are 8 rows in a rubric. There's a rubric document that you can download, and it's probably the closest thing to a recipe for writing yourself a 5 on the actual Explore task. Each row, you either get the point or you don't. It's a 1 or a 0. And so if you take a look at row 1, for example, row 1 is the grade for the computational artifact. Now notice there are 8 rows and there's only 1 row. You only get 1 point for the computational artifact. So yes, you've got to do a good computational artifact, but remember that 7/8 of your score is going to come from the written narrative. So that's where most of your points are coming from. Now, the computational artifact, you'll notice in abbreviated form here, it basically says it must identify the computing innovation, so that would be like a title, and provides an illustration, representation, or explanation of its purpose, function, or effect. And then you'll notice that there are some notes to readers. This is what readers will use when they grade these computational artifacts. Do not award a point if it's not a computational artifact, if it's just a photo of a whiteboard. If they write about one innovation but have a different innovation in the artifact, if it doesn't clearly represent it, if either the computational, if taken together, the computational artifact and the written response don't explain its intended purpose, function, or effect, then you can't get a point for it. You can see that a computational artifact in the scoring notes is something that's created by a human using a computer, and then they give you some examples. So there are a lot of good definitions here. It's definitely worth going through the rubric. It's definitely worth going over this with students, have them look at the rubric, because this will really help answer a lot of the questions that they're going to have about what counts and what doesn't count. Row 2 is, does your written response state a fact about the computing innovation's purpose or its function? And this is where you would get a point this is where you would lose a point if it's not a computing innovation. But there are some examples in the scoring notes as well. So, example, one very common mistake is you choose something that's not a computing innovation at all. So for instance, the Human Genome Project, that's an initiative where scientists are trying to sequence the human DNA. That is not a computing innovation. It's an initiative of people. Now they may use computers, so like a DNA sequencer or a DNA sequencing algorithm or program, that is a computing innovation. But the Human Genome Project, not an innovation. So again, choose things that are going to be pretty easy to make the case for it. Um, I had a student one time trying to make this very, very long, drawn out, complicated argument for why an abacus was a computing innovation, because at that time it was essentially an analog form of a computer. And why, right? Just pick a computer, pick something after 1954, pick something easier to go with. To be honest, in practice, anything older than like the Enigma machine, I think would be a hard thing to make a case for. Um, all right, virtual reality. So here's an example of a computational artifact. And let's take a look at this. Does this identify the computing innovation? Yes, it does. It's virtual reality. Does it explain the purpose, function, or effect? Yes. How it works. It displays data at high def quality. It sends user data, it tracks user information. We've got some images here. This counts. This is a good computational artifact. It could be better, probably, but I mean, this counts. This counts. Here's another one, stats. Let's think about this. Does this explain the purpose, the function, or the effect of virtual reality? If I'm looking at this and I read it, I can see, okay, virtual reality, that identifies it. This doesn't really say how it works. It doesn't say anything about its purpose or its function. However, it does mention its effect. And we have the effect on the population of virtual worlds, the unit sales. We can see the sales are going up. So I would count this. So this would probably get a point as well. Now, to be honest, I think these two probably go together. I think this is a two-pager. So certainly, of course, this gets the point. But even taken each of them individually would probably get a point as well. Look at this one. This is an interesting one, right? There's no words on it except the choice is yours, which is somewhat ambiguous. I can't even tell, is it a glider? Is it a sniper rifle? What is it that they're talking about? And so it's hard to tell from looking at the computational artifact what the computing innovation is, or even its purpose, function, or an effect. So as a reader, when I look at this, I then go to the written response of 2A, and you can see that the student has said drones are represented by my computational artifact. My artifact illustrates the purpose and effect of my computing innovation. On the right, probably positive uses, and on the left, negative uses is what it looks like. So the student has told me what their computational artifact illustrates and how it illustrates what it is. That counts. But this is an example where if you don't have the written response, or if they didn't really write the written response very well, or didn't say much about, if they just talked about drones but not how their computational artifact illustrated the purpose and effect, then they wouldn't get the point. But here, this is a good written response taken in conjunction with the images. This gets the point for computational artifact. Here's another one, Bitcoins. What are Bitcoins? So this identifies it. They're a form of cryptocurrency which can be used on the internet to buy and sell items. That is the function of Bitcoins. So this counts. So they get a point as well. So you don't have to do much, right? You just need a few pictures. You need some explanatory text. Um, you don't have to do a whole lot. So here's another one. This one is machine learning versus artificial intelligence. Hard to tell exactly what's going on here. It looks like there's a feedback loop. Learner modifies the parameter based on results. Parameters are the factors used to make a prediction. It's clear from the arrows that there's a loop of some sort that results in learning, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. So, you know, purpose, function, or effect, yeah, this probably gets it. I mean, there's no pictures, but what are you going to take pictures of really for machine learning? I don't know. So this counts. So this gets a point. It's not great from a design standpoint, but this counts. What about this one? This is the Plan B oral contraceptive. Uh-oh. Um, this student put in a bunch of different memes, I think. It, does it say what the purpose is? I suppose it does. Its function, yeah, probably, or when you would use it, certainly. But the biggest problem here is that the oral contraceptive is not a computing innovation, right? It doesn't involve a computer at all. So this gets a 0, not because of the actual computational artifact, but because what they chose is not a computing innovation. So it gets a 0 on this one. Here's the effect of e-commerce on the consumer. So here's a before and an after. So before e-commerce, woman going crazy, having to drive to different things, and afterward, happy woman, and now she can just sit at her computer and doesn't have to drive anywhere. So it kind of lays it out. Again, no points for design, right? Like you could have a beautifully designed thing, and I think it's good design is important anyway. It's good to emphasize that with students, good to practice good design. If you use some of the built-in templates and pages, and certainly in Keynote, you'll come out with some beautifully designed computational artifacts. But again, just speak from the rubric, they're not grading design. They're just grading, does it illustrate purpose, function, or effect? And this one gets the point. This one does it too. It just makes me sad a little on the inside, but that's just me. So rubric part 2, the response must state a fact about the correctly identified computing innovation's purpose or function. Most common mistake is something that's not a computing innovation. So, okay, that's rows 1 and 2. Let's go on to rows 3, 4, and 5. So 3, 4, and 5, there's a lot here, but they're really all focused on the response for 2C, where students are basically asked to talk about a beneficial and a harmful effect and how one of those applies to society, economy, or culture. And it's kind of a staged approach. The way we used to grade this is we used to grade it, like on a, good, better, best kind of scenario. And this is sort of like that good, better, best. If you just talk about one effect at all, if you just get one effect, you get row 3. If you talk about both a beneficial and a harmful effect, then you get row 4. If you talk about a beneficial and harmful effect and you get row 4, you automatically get row 3 because they're staged, right? You can't get row 4 without getting a point on row 3. So I often will just look for row 4 and say beneficial and harmful effect. Yep, they're both there. Okay, 3's got a 1, 4's got a 1. 5, how one of those effects relates to society, economy, or culture. That's that's kind of important. You need to relate it to groups or individuals. Um, Relate that to society, economy, or culture. If you talk about how a computing innovation like Enhanced 911 improves the lives or the jobs of firefighters or EMTs, that's a group in society, so that you could make a case that that's a societal benefit. So if you want to get all 3 points, so 3, 4, and 5, you need to identify a beneficial effect, you need to identify a harmful effect, and you need to talk about how one of those effects relates to society, economy, or culture. So let's talk about row 3 first. At least one effect of the identified or described computing innovation. So this is an effect now. This is how it affects society. The most common mistake is kids make a mistake. They confuse effect and a feature of it. And there's confusion between something that's a direct effect of a computing innovation and some outside influence that might serve to break the innovation. The effect has to be a result of the intended use of the innovation. So for that last point, suppose my innovation is a smart lock on my front door that I can open with my iPhone. And I say that a harmful effect of this is that an intruder might use a sledgehammer to break through my door. Okay, that's not a harmful effect of the smart lock, because anybody with a sledgehammer can break into pretty much anything. Um, if the smart lock, like let's say I'm doing some company's smart lock, and they have a bug in their app that allows people to exploit that bug and gain access to people's doors remotely and open them. You could make a plausible case that that is a harmful effect directly of the smart lock technology itself. But you'd have to go that far to say that the harmful effect is, it's related to something about their software itself. If you just say, well, this could be hacked, Apple Pay can be hacked, and that's a harmful effect, that doesn't count. Anything can be hacked. You have to say that it's something that is inherent to the innovation itself. So here's an example. You could say one harmful effect is that HomePod is always on if you don't turn it off. It can listen to every conversation that is going on around the HomePod. Its microphone is always on. We see this all the time. This is not an effect. That's a feature. The feature is that HomePod is always on. It's always listening. You need to go further and say the effect of this is that your conversations could be monitored and sent somewhere else, or your conversation could be archived or backed up, which is not technically true for the HomePod. So they have to actually make a plausible, truthful case for what is the harmful effect. So the student hasn't really gone far enough here to get that point. Row 4, you have to both do a beneficial effect and a harmful effect. So most common mistakes are they talk about two effects, but they don't identify one as beneficial or harmful. Or they just talk about one effect and they leave off the other one. You have to talk about you have to say specifically, this is a beneficial effect, this is a harmful effect. Sometimes what we will accept is if someone says, one effect of this is blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, a negative effect is blah, 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 blah. We will assume because you've said on the other hand, or however, or but, and then you identify the second one as negative, we will assume the first one is positive because of that grammar. But unless you do something like that, you have to say it's beneficial or harmful. One kind of crazy example that we'll use is one effect of Enhanced 911 is that it will result in fewer trips it will result in faster emergency response and more lives will be saved as a result. You can't just assume that more lives are being saved as a result, that people will assume that that's beneficial. You have to say that that's beneficial. Crazy, I know, but you do need to say. So for instance, here's an example. Augmented reality has significant potential to change the way we interact in the future by providing us with beneficial information such as time, messages, directions, and other relevant or timely information with ease. Great. Information is beneficial, but what's the effect? Right? We have ease of access to all of this stuff, but so what? And that's another question that we'll train our readers to say, so what? We read this, why is that good? Augmented reality has significant potential to change the way we interact in the future by providing us with beneficial information with ease. This has a beneficial effect because it allows us to save time getting to our destination. And save time means more productivity, which is a benefit to the economy. They need to go a little farther in order to get that point. So this as written doesn't get the point. This would be a 0. You have to write a little bit more. So row 5, how one of those effects relates to society, economy, or culture. You might mention the effects, but if you don't actually relate it to society, economy, or culture, and I would use those words. So I would coach the kids to use the word society. This is beneficial to society because this is harmful to our economy because we are not allowed as readers to infer anything. So the students need to be very explicit. Often we'll look at responses that imply a beneficial effect to society, but if they don't say it, we can't give them the point. So here's an example. One benefit of the Apple Watch is that it automatically records everything you do physically. You do not need to enter your heart rate. So that's good. That's a beneficial effect. They've said one benefit about it, it automatically records. So we're good there. You do not need to enter your heart rate. The Apple Watch does it for you. Notice the student said hear rate, but I can read that and I can assume they mean heart rate. That is one area where we are allowed to make some inferences because one of the things about the AP Computer Science Principles course is it's been much more inclusive of lots of different students. So there are a number of students who are ESL students, and so we do not want them to be penalized because of a language barrier. So we are not grading grammar or spelling. If it's obvious from their grammar or spelling what the literal words are that they're saying, that is okay. One harmful effect is that the Apple Watch is always listening to you just in case you say, "Hey Siri," and so it's transmitting everything through a microphone that's always on. Okay, again, this one, it's not related to society, economy, or culture. So this person gets a point for 3, they get a point for 4, they don't get a point for 5. They actually have to say, again, I think this is a dead end argument. The harmful effect is it's always listening to you, at least for the Apple Watch, because they're not caching any of that stuff. But you'd have to say the harmful effect on I don't know what you would say for society, economy, or culture. Yeah, they'd have to think of something else, I think, and then they would have to literally say society, economy, or culture. Okay, let's take a look at this one. A beneficial effect self-driving cars could have on society is less car accidents. According to Statista, in the United States alone, there were 37,000 car accident-related fatalities in 2016. Self-driving cars could cut down that number. One harmful effect self-driving cars could have is the moral ambiguity when a car accident eventually does happen. Who's to blame? Do you blame the people in the car, the manufacturers, the company that sells the car? The legal catastrophe could single-handedly end any chance of having self-driving cars, which would negate any benefit of having self-driving cars. Society could be held back if this problem isn't solved. So we're looking for a number of things. Did they mention at least one beneficial or harmful effect? Sure. One beneficial effect they could have is fewer car accidents. So that's one. They got that. Did they mention a harmful effect? Yes, they did. Boom. They got points for 3 and 4. Now, the last thing we got to look at is did they talk about its effect on society? I would argue they did not go far enough here. The moral ambiguity when it does happen, who is to blame? Do you blame? Okay, so these questions, who is to blame? Do you blame the people in the car? Then blah, 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 blah. Those are examples of what this person is calling moral ambiguity. So if the harmful effect is moral ambiguity itself, what is the effect of moral ambiguity on society? Does it mean more trials? Potentially. This student then says the legal catastrophe. I don't know, perhaps they're referring to more trials. Could single-handedly end any chance of having them, which would negate any benefit because we don't have any. And then they make this kind of overarching argument, society could be held back. What does that even mean? Society could be held back if this problem isn't solved. The student doesn't go far enough here. There needs to be a little bit more to hang on this. How could we rewrite this? The moral ambiguity, when it eventually does happen, could result in more trials, which is a burden on the legal system. If people become aware that this moral ambiguity leads to greater liability while they're driving, this could hold people back from purchasing self-driving cars, which would kill it in the marketplace, and that would be an economic catastrophe. So the student needs to kind of tie more of these things together. This is borderline on 5. Agreed. It is borderline. But in a lot of these cases, I'm going to try to show you purposely examples of borderline examples because I think those are the most useful to look at. It's less useful, I think, to look at something that clearly hits all the marks, clearly does it, or ones that are clearly they don't match any of them. The hardest parts for you as teachers with your students, the hardest part is going to be figuring out, is this one really going to get the point or not? It's looking at the borderline cases. So we got to look at these gray areas. So this is about Tumblr. And you'll notice that you can pause this if you want to read the whole thing. But basically, we are looking for, rows 3, 4, and 5 here. So is there a harmful effect, a beneficial effect, and its effect on society? So notice that they use the words good and bad thing, which is they have a lack of guidelines. So the lack of guidelines has the effect of allowing individuals to create and upload their own content. But the downside is that there is not much regulation on the content that is uploaded, which means there's quite a bit of pornographic and self-harmful content. So that's a harmful effect. That's a beneficial effect. Is there an effect on society? Since there are over 300 million blogs, that small fraction of people with pornographic, self-harmful content turns out to be quite a lot of people. Okay, so what? So there's not enough of a connection to society. So just this alone, they probably would get points for 3 and 4, but not for 5. But there's more. So it goes on. So the student then says, because Tumblr has such a large following, they're able to reach a wide range of audiences. One example of how it uses following to spread a positive message, they teamed up with Planned Parenthood. They created a campaign called Care That Counts. It helped shed some light on the stigma surrounding abortion. So they're going a little bit farther. I still would want to see the word society here, but there's enough that I would probably give this point to that student and say, oh, okay, this covers 5. This talks about how the beneficial effect of Tumblr on society and how this affects an audience. So to me, this would count. Okay, so that's rows 3, 4, and 5. If we talk about rows 6, 7, and 8, that is your response. 2D and 8 is just, did you cite your sources? So 2D primarily is going to ask, you'll see an example of what the prompt is, but basically they're saying, okay, what kind of data does it use and how's that data consumed? And so whatever computing innovation they choose, they need to be prepared to talk about what kind of data is consumed, produced, or transformed, and what does it rely on? Now, data types, these are the data types specifically from the scoring notes that they include. So integers, numbers, booleans, text, image, video, audio, signals, or types of data that infer those types like fingerprints. So like if I use Touch ID as a computing innovation, I could say that the data is the fingerprint. The fingerprint is the data. Temperature, music, length, pictures, things like that are allowed. But students need to be specific about what the data is. So when the student talks about the type of data that it consumes, how it's produced or transformed, the most common mistakes are they talk about the sensor as data. Sensors are not data. Sensors collect data, and you need to identify what kind of data that sensor is collecting. Here's an example. The iPhone inputs data by using different types of cameras, microphones, and a light sensor. Okay, great. We haven't identified what kind of data it's bringing in, right? Cameras, microphones, and light sensors, that's not data. You would have to say something along the lines of the iPhone processes pictures and images and audio signals, or if you were writing about text to speech or speech to text, you could basically say the microphone takes in an audio signal, the iPhone transforms it into a text message that you can then send using messages. That would be an example of how you bring in the data, what the data is, and how it's transformed or produced. This is the full prompt for 2D, right? Using specific details in 250 words, students need to write about what kind of data does it use, how does it consume it as input, produce it as output, or transform it, And they need to write about at least one data storage concern, data privacy concern, or data security concern that's directly related to the computing innovation. And that's what we're going to talk about row 7. The most common mistake is they talk about a concern, but they don't connect that concern to the computing innovation and describe why. Why is it a concern? So here's a general concern that you might see. If some people don't take actions on their privacy, such as sharing their profiles to the rest of the world, then they may allow other people to find out personal information about them, such as gender, where they live, how old they are, and other possible information. Okay, why is that a concern? They've implied that it's a concern that other people have personal information about, but why is that bad? It might lead to cyber stalking, or it might lead to denying you credit for a loan based on information that's not directly connected to your loan application. They need to talk a little bit more about that. And it also needs to be connected to the computing innovation itself, whatever it happens to be, however that computing innovation handles privacy, they need to make that connection in order to get the point. So just like all of these examples, this doesn't get the point here. Finally, with row 8, they just need to have at least 3 different citations. So in-text citation, they can use footnotes, or they can use like endnotes at the end and then just have a number and then put the number in their text. Other students will often use they'll have last name, first name for author, and then title at the bottom, and then they'll just cite to the author. That's another way to do it. However they do it, there's no specific format that students need to use, but they need to have some way to have inline citations that show what it is that they're citing, and then they need to have at least 3 reference sources at the bottom. And they can cite, of course, to online websites and things like that. So here's a sample example for 2D, and I've put the assignment at the top, and here's the sample response. Bitcoins are backed up from real currency all over the world. To acquire Bitcoins, you must use the internet to find data, download software, make accounts for your digital wallet, and join pools. When a computer mines for Bitcoins, it is really solving equations to generate numbers that are the equivalent to decimals of a Bitcoin. The longer the computer runs, the more money you can potentially make. By mining Bitcoins, you are transforming data into money. The only data concern linked to Bitcoin usage is the possibility of using this currency for illegal items, which can be a health and security threat. So we're looking for rows 5, 6, and 7. Did they talk about what kind of, no, I'm sorry, rows 6 and 7. 3, 4, and 5 deal with harmful and beneficial effects on society. This is rows 6 and 7. Did they talk about the type of data that's used and how it's consumed, produced, or transformed? And did they talk about a data security concern or privacy concern and connect it to the innovation itself? So here's what the College Board has said about it. So row 6 gets 0 points. They didn't state, they state how it mines for Bitcoin by solving equations to generate numbers that are equivalent, and that by mining Bitcoins, you're transforming data into money, but it doesn't identify the data itself that's being transformed into money. So they do need to show that they understand a little bit about the technology itself. With something like Bitcoin, you're going to need to talk about the algorithms and how you're coming up with unique crypto secure codes that can be equated to money. Row 7, the response expresses a concern linked to Bitcoin usage as the possibility of using this currency for illegal items. But again, this is kind of like a hacking argument. This is basically saying you could use this for nefarious purposes, but that's not a function of the computing innovation. That's a function of the people who are using it, right? So that's not directly associated with the technology itself. And then there's no inline citations at all, so we can't even give it a point for row 8. No citations. So let's take a look at another one. So this is a portion of it, but this is most self-driving cars use LiDAR. The sensor works by sending out pulses of light at various intervals and collects the data based on when the light returns to the sensor. It turns light into positional data of the things around the car. One data privacy concern is whether or not the companies collect the data the self-driving car collects. Companies could use that information to profile what type of driver you are and then sell that data to other companies who could do whatever they want with that information. Okay, so some concerns here. Do they talk about the type of data it uses and how it's produced and transformed? Yes, they do. They collect the data based on when the light returns to the sensor. That kind of implies time. It turns light into positional data. So those signals, it turns it into positional data of the things around the car. So yeah, we probably would give that to them. One data privacy concern is whether or not the companies collect the data. Companies could use that information to profile what type of data you are. So what? And then they sell that data. So what? This is not, they haven't stated why that's a concern. Okay, it's simply that they could collect the data and then profile what type of driver you are. Again, they're implying a lot here that this is bad because, but then we would have to infer too much. The reason this is bad is maybe your insurance premiums go up because now other companies, or maybe you're turned down for a loan because you're a bad driver. And those companies have purchased data from your driving record to make to basically make conclusions about whether you are a trustworthy borrower. That's what they would need to say, and this student doesn't go far enough to get that point on that. And arguably, again, these are all borderline cases. I would like to see them say more specifically, the data that's collected is based off of the number of milliseconds or something along those lines, or it measures the amount of time that it takes for the light to go out and return to the sensor. And using those numbers, it then comes up with a map of what's around the car. I'd like more detail there, but you know, it. I think this is borderline. You could go either way on this. So just to summarize, we've talked about the Explore performance task. We've gone through all of the different kinds of responses people are asked to give. We've given you some examples of different responses. You've looked at the rubric, which has got 8 rows in it. You should understand that each row of the rubric, it's a binary rubric, so it's either 1 or 0 points. So just to summarize some examples, there are lots of examples of real kid samples on the College Board website. So if you just look up College Board or AP Computer Science Principles exam, you can click on the different examples and you'll actually see commentary from the College Board on what scores they gave those examples and why. And that's really important, not only for you to understand, but also for the kids to understand. So I would show kids how to access that and have them read through those examples and maybe use it as a classroom example. Definitely give kids the rubric. They're not going to be, well, the rubric's been published so that kids can look at it. They should be able to use that rubric just like any teacher and go through and look at somebody else's work and grade it using the rubric. And the rubric's pretty specific, so they should be pretty uh, consistent with what that score is. So there's no surprises. They should know what will count. And that's why I really think it's important to have kids collaborate, work with each other, and give each other feedback on each other's responses. So in Explore Task Practice 1, that's where the kids are all writing about one topic. And that one, as a teacher, you should grade. So you should just grade your entire class so that you're giving them consistent feedback so that they know what it's like and what it would grade. But then in part two, I would break the kids up into groups by what they chose, by what topic they chose, and then have the kids grade each other and give each other feedback. So there are some ways to automate this. So peergrade.io is a great tool that is online. It's free, and I'll break that up and assign that to kids, and it'll keep track. It'll assign automatically. It'll assign to kids other kids' responses and that are anonymous, and then it'll keep track of whether your kids gave them feedback and all kinds of stuff. And it'll even allows them to grade back and say, I agree with this feedback or I don't agree. So that's super helpful. And then finally, probably the biggest thing that I can recommend that would help if you're a teacher and you're teaching this, become a reader. So apply to the College Board. It's like 10 days in June, or it's like a week in June, and they'll pay you to go out there and they'll train you to read these things. And it's also a great way to get together with other teachers across the country who are also teaching this course and share ideas and resources. It's super, super helpful. So I can't recommend that enough. Try it out, become an AP reader. It's a great experience. So hopefully this has been helpful, and good luck teaching.